Hey, my friends. Today we are going to be diving into this idea of making our money more joyful. And let me begin by simply saying that I find it absolutely mind boggling that we live in a capitalist society that essentially just throws us to the wolves, financially speaking, right? We don't tend to have a course on it in high school. We don't tend to have any type of training. And most of us really learn through figuring it out on our own. And typically that means making mistakes and correcting them over time. And the fact of the matter is that the margin for error when it comes to making those mistakes is thinner than it has ever been. So this is a vastly important conversation to be having right now. It's important to be asking questions like, what are some of the steps that we can take to strengthen our relationship with one of our most contentious tools? I think that the problem with a lot of traditional personal finance advice out there is that it ends up recommending tactics that work against our human psychology rather than creating systems that work with it. So, with that said, let's go ahead and jump into our agenda for today. First things first, we're going to have an overview of today's economy and some of the ways in which it has shifted from the historical economy. Then I'll tell you a little bit about my background and perspective, and then we'll jump into it with the starting point, which I believe is psychology and mindset when it comes to money management. So we'll talk about how we talk about money in our society. We'll talk about culture, perception, and then I'll give a brief analogy for you into your hero's journey. Then we'll talk about goals and getting started. Finally, we'll dive into the numbers. And the important thing to remember with the numbers is we are intentionally trying to not get stuck in the small details, get stuck in the weeds, as they say. Instead, we want to understand the numbers as a way to return to having these rich conversations about how do I want to use money to design the life that I want to live. So we'll start off with the numbers by defining a common language. Then we'll talk about this idea of cash flow and how do we flow with our cash, meaning make it intuitive and simple for us to know that we're doing things right to live for today and tomorrow. And finally, we'll go through a couple of examples, real world examples of a tool or a resource for you that you can use to begin to apply these principles in your life. So first things first, we're going to talk just a little bit about today's economy and compare it to the historical economy. So what you see here is a chart comparing numbers from 1980 to 2022. At some point, we'll continue to update them as we get more and more data from the most recent time periods that we have. But this is pretty telling to begin with. In 1980, and let's actually start down here with the starting salary with a bachelor's degree and median family income. What we see is the first number here is the inflation adjusted number. Just for reference, you have the uninflation adjusted number in parentheses. But what we see is when we compare the starting salary with a bachelor's degree in 1980 to 2022, we're at almost the same value. And the same is true for median family income, is we see that the inflation adjusted value for 1980 is the same as it was in 2022. And yet some of the other big rocks in our financial jars have changed quite a bit. So the first one is the cost of tuition, fees, room and board. So essentially cost of education. And that's not even factoring in student loans. And what we can see is that number has more than doubled since 1980. We also see a similar trend when we look at the median home price or the median rent. Cost of housing has gone up almost double once you inflation adjust the numbers from 1980. And this chart doesn't even include another big rock in our financial jars that many people have, not everybody, which is childcare, which has gone up drastically. And of course, we know that the smaller living expenses, groceries, all of those things may have also gone up, but these are the big rocks in our financial jar. So when they get that much bigger, it means that we have less room in the jar for everything else. And it means we really need to create systems that allow us to thrive and flourish in today's world. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is that we have seen a shift in the responsibility within our society. So, what I mean is that we used to have what were called defined benefit plans. Those were things like pensions. The defined benefit meant that you got the benefit, whatever that was, usually it was some percentage of your salary, once you retired. What that meant is that it was the company's responsibility to manage that retirement money in that pension fund to ensure that you were paid that amount for the rest of your life after retirement. Well, we have seen a shift away from those types of plans and into what are called defined contribution plans. What that means is that the employer will choose, if any, to match a certain percentage of your defined contribution into, for example, a 401k. And the reason that is important to bring up is because that plan is managed by you, the individual, rather than by the company. So this means we have seen a shift away from a communal responsibility for long-term finances and towards an individual responsibility. All that to say, it's more and more important for us to take ownership in our financial management. Let me give you a little bit of background to who the heck I am. My name is Marshall Moore. I'm the Director of Community Impact and Financial Wellbeing over at On Tap Credit Union. And my story is I was a high school math teacher for 10 years. And I started a financial literacy curriculum. Originally, it was for my second semester seniors. You know how it goes. They get senioritis. They go, when am I ever going to use this stuff? And I was like, hey, I'm just being real with you all. A lot of this math that we teach you in high school, you won't ever use again, right? There's the old joke about, I'm so glad they taught me trigonometry. It helped, so helpful every trigonometry season or whatever it is, right? And so the personal finance side of thing really became something that was so needed, because how many of us are going to have to use money in our lives? Everybody, right? Because I'm a teacher, I want to say this up front, that my goal here is to empower you. I don't want to prescribe some exact plan that you need to follow. Instead, the goal is to be able to give you a hammer, give you a tape measure, give you a tool belt, and then you are going to decide where you're going to drive the nails and what you're going to build with it. The other thing that I will say is, as a teacher, one of the big learnings that I had was, you know how it goes. I was a math teacher, right? So I loved to nerd out on the numbers. And so I had kind of just assumed that if I showed people this beautiful compounding interest spreadsheet, that would make them want to take ownership of their money, right? And it turns out that no, of course not. We're human beings. It starts here and it starts here. It starts with our emotions, our feelings, our perceptions of money to begin with. So as we jump into it, I believe step number one is to begin to understand our money psychology, because we all come to money from a different perspective. And it's not just, did I grow up without money or did I grow up with an overabundance of it? Of course, you'll see it from a different angle if you grew up in one of those circumstances, but you could have been anywhere along the spectrum of income and you could still see money as being the root of all evil, right? Or conversely, you may have grown up in an entrepreneurial family and you could see money as being the value exchange that I get when I do good in the world. So if you believe one of those things or the other, or any of the millions of beliefs in between and outside of those, do you think you're going to handle your money differently? Probably, right? Because if money is the root of all evil, and I believe that, whether or not I even realize I believe it, then if I get more money, I become one of them. Or maybe I could believe that I could become corrupted by it and only pursue money and forsake my family time or whatever, right? So let's talk a little bit deeper about where some of these influences come from. So the first is how we talk about money in our society, if we even talk about it at all, since for the most part, it's a taboo subject that we tend to not talk about. But when we think about things that we say about money in our society, one of the phrases that comes to mind for me is, what do we say when something costs a lot? And the phrase that I hear or I've heard is, it costs an arm and a leg. Like, really? Like, that's how serious money is? We're going to be giving up our limbs to go out there and get it? Or another one of the phrases that comes to mind is more money, more problems. Another one that I'm like, really? Like, why not more money, more opportunities? Right? And so all of these types of phrases lead us to the second point, which is that we all come to money with an individual perspective. And I mentioned some of those earlier, but just to mention another example is, if I grew up hearing time is money over and over again, then I might feel guilty when I'm not actively working to make more money, rather than recognizing that money is one of many types of wealth or health. And that if I get to a place where my spouse, say, really values social or relational health more than financial health, they might start to resent me for working so much and not spending enough quality time with my family. Whereas I'm over here thinking the way I support my family is by working more to bring in more income, right? So this leads us to the next bullet here, which is money dynamics. Money dynamics are when two or more people are deciding together how they want to use money as the tool that allows them to design the lives they want to live. And that means that money dynamics are always co-created. It's never one person just creating them by themselves. And so, as you could tell in that earlier example, you could get to a situation where, with a family member, your values, if we don't recognize what they are, we're talking on completely different planes. And so we need to begin to recognize what that is, so that we can then begin to have more productive conversations about it. And finally, the next point here is this idea of cultural values. There's this old business phrase that somebody said, I'm not sure where it comes from, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have the best strategy in the world in business, and the culture of the company is still going to outweigh it. And that is certainly the case also with our money. When we think about how we perceive money, different cultures perceive it in a very different way. Some cultures may perceive money from a very individualistic perspective, and other cultures take a very communal perspective on money. We are all in this together. What's mine is yours. If we are not thinking about those perspectives when we're designing the systems that will work for us in our own lives, then we may end up not designing a system that works well for the holistic perspective of our life. And finally, the last bullet here is the idea of intentional choices. If we're not careful, it's easy to drift with the crowd. It's easy to forget about subscriptions, and all of a sudden we realize we have 15 different subscriptions that we're not using. And the point there is, if we can get intentional with how we're going to use our money, then we can decide what we're doing now on purpose and also be able to plan for the future. The perhaps deeper, darker part of this intentionality conversation is that there's really two ways to use money. And one is what I've been talking about. It's as a tool to design your life. The other is as a measuring stick to compare yourself against others. And it is really easy to slip into the latter unless you are intentional about spending time deciding how you want to use this tool. So pause here to just say kudos to you for investing in this educational session. Okay, we talked a little bit about intentionality, and that in general, if we're not intentional, we can slip into unconscious actions. This quote from Carl Jung, I love. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. But there's a second part to this unconscious decision side of things that deals with how we actually make decisions as human beings. So the story here is, in the world of finance and economics, there was this idea for a long time that human beings were what we call rational actors, and that somehow we would be able to analyze all of the information in front of us and come to the decision that most maximized our economic utility. And it's like, no, we're not, right? But it wasn't until these two psychologists came along named Kahneman and Tversky. And they basically said to the world of economics, hey guys, no, we don't always analyze every single piece of information and seek to maximize our economic utility. No, we oftentimes will make decisions based on intuition, on our gut feel, or on emotions. And what we're doing when we do that is we're creating mental shortcuts for ourselves. The benefit to that is that when we create mental shortcuts, we use less energy, which is advantageous evolutionarily, right? Like if I don't have to think deeply about something and instead I got a pre-programmed shortcut, then I can save myself some energy. But the problem is that there are certain ways, certain mental shortcuts that we use that we consistently get wrong. So essentially what they said is, hey, if we can start to identify what some of those are, then we can use that to help us make better financial decisions overall. Okay, been talking for a little while, so I want you to do a quick activity with me. In this activity, I want you to envision. So actually, this will be a full visualization. You can even close your eyes and picture this in your mind's eye. And we're going to make it something simple. So get in your car, in your mind's eye, and pretend that you're driving to work or wherever you drove last. You're going to pull up to a stop sign and look up and to the right at that stop sign, and you just yell it out to your computer there. What is the color of the stop sign? And if you're like most people, hopefully you just yelled out red. But there's a trick here. I want you to tell me the colors of the stop sign, not just the color. And of course, at this point, it's pretty obvious. Check it out. Look at this stop sign here. It's red and white. So with that said, let's do one more visualization and then we'll get to the real point here. So let's stick with the same theme. We'll stay in the car and you're driving along the road a little bit further down the road. And this time I want you to envision that you see a yield sign on the road and yell out the colors, both colors of the yield sign for me. Go. If you are like most people, you just yelled out yellow and black. But yield signs aren't yellow and black, they're red and white. So what happened? Why do most people yell out yellow and black when they are faced with that visualization? And the answer is because we use mental shortcuts, right? In this case, I had you look at a stop sign surrounded by a whole bunch of other different types of road signs that happen to all be yellow and black. And we make the mental shortcut of, oh yeah, all other types of road signs are yellow and black, but the stop sign, that's the only one that's red and white, right? And so that is actually called the availability heuristic. I gave you some information that was available right in front of you that other types of road signs tend to be yellow and black. And so that is where that particular mental shortcut stems from. And the point here is not to now go through a giant whole, exhaustive list of mental shortcuts that we make, but instead to simply say that we do this type of a thing when we are thinking about our money decisions. And so instead, what we want to try to do is create systems that act as bumper lanes for us to work within and begin to really understand intuitively how we want to manage our money. Okay, this is the idea of the hero's journey. So I think it is super important that everybody has to be on their own hero's journey when it comes to our money management. So many people out there want somebody else to just do it for them, but nobody will have the same level of regard for you and your future as you do. So I encourage you to get on your hero's journey. And along the way, you will face monsters. So I'll mention some of those, but also along the way, you will encounter, hopefully, your kind and compassionate guides, which is my goal. I want to be your Obi-Wan of your money management journey. Some of the, or maybe Yoda. Yoda's, both of them are pretty cool. Some of the monsters that you'll face along the journey, I put a few of them in here just for example. And of course, I had to throw student loans in there because that is such a topic for many people in today's world. But the three that I wanted to highlight are this idea of digital money. For one, we don't use physical money, handing it over very often anymore. And so instead, we have to deal with just being able to tap a card to pay for something. And so that means that there is a missing layer, perhaps, of us having this direct feedback with our money. And that means that, again, we need to create some of those systems that serve as bumper lanes where we can get that direct feedback. We'll talk about those in a moment. Another thing that comes up in our current hero's journey is comparison. We live in the age of social media. It's really easy to see Jack and Jill down the street going on another vacation, or whoever else, John next door has bought a Tesla and blah, blah, blah. And it's really easy to compare. But the thing about social media, for example, is that we don't actually see everything in somebody's life. We see just the best parts, the highlights that people want to share. And when it comes to things that people have, Morgan Housel says it best, I think. He says, you can see rich because rich is the money that people spend, but wealth, that's the money that you don't spend. It's hard to see that somebody's got millions of dollars going into brokerages accounts because they may still be driving, the Toyota Camry that's beat up from 2000, whereas they're putting most of their money towards that investment account. And the last thing that I wanted to just mention is this idea of information overload. There are so many people out there trying to say, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to buy a house, you got to whatever it is, that it can get overwhelming. It can feel like, where am I supposed to find just the easy, concise path? So these were all of the things that you will have to deal with along the journey. But in these regards, getting started is more important than becoming an expert. Your effort, the actions you take, that sets your floor. Your strategy tends to set your ceiling. So if you have already started, then making sure you're working on the right thing is more important than just trying to work harder or track more expenses. And so I'm excited to get to some of that information today. One more thing that I'll throw in there is to stop telling yourself that you're not qualified, you're not good enough, you're not worthy. Growth happens when you start doing the things you're not qualified to do. And that's something that comes from James Clear. Let's talk about goals for a little bit, because I don't think that this money management game is about you just gotta buckle down further and be more disciplined. And I don't think it's either about having a better app or a better spreadsheet. That is all trying to throw a technical solution at what we've already said is an emotional, a human problem. And for some reason, we're surprised when all that stuff doesn't work. So how about we start designing systems that work with our money psychology rather than against it? And to do this, the first step is we need to set our goals in a way that resonates with our own psychology. And one of the principles that comes from psychology in this regard is we have to begin to live by a vision of the future rather than a memory of the past. So many traditional budgets get us stuck in the past, right? We get to the end of the month and we have to go back and review our expenses and track everything, and we beat ourselves up for, I went over my budget again. What am I going to do next month to not do that? Instead, we need to begin to set that rich vision for our future. What is it that we want to do? How do we want to live our lives? And then from there, we can create a percentage-based system that will get us there more intuitively. One more thing that comes up when we're talking about creating some of these systems is this idea of cash flow. Cash flow is the lifeblood of our finances, and yet it can be really challenging to understand. Many people think, I got income, I got expenses, and I got my savings and investments, and that's really it. But the thing is, we like to think in a very static manner, and all of those things are dynamic. They're changing often when it comes to our money. For most people, income can be variable. Even if you have a salary, you may work some overtime or get a bonus. Of course, if you're in another structure, commission or hourly, then of course your income is going to be variable. And for almost everybody, our expenses can be variable. So when you think about what's happening with cash flow, it's like one of those buckets filled with water, and there's water coming in, but it's at a variable rate. And there's also water going out, but it's at a variable rate. So the math behind that is really, really hard math. It's differential equations. And so I don't want to be doing differential equations just to manage my money. And so instead, there's this idea that comes from multiple other languages, which have more than one word for to know something. So German is a good example. There's two words, Kenntnis and Wissenschaft. To know intellectually, to understand it. And then there's to know through experience, to know intuitively what to do. It's like learning how to ride a bike. I might see somebody do it and understand what's happening, momentum. But in order to know how to do it, I have to engage in it. And that process of transferring the intellectual knowledge to the intuitive knowledge, it does take some time and practice. And it means we have to get immediate feedback in order to know what we're doing there. One more thing that I wanted to say on this idea of the equation of personal finance. Many people think of it as income minus our expenses equals our savings, right? So I have my income, my paycheck, I pay what I need to pay, and then whatever's left over at the end of the month, that's what I'm going to send towards my savings. That does not work. There's this idea known as Parkinson's law, where essentially what it says is that the time allotted to a task, you'll expand the amount of time you use on it to fill whatever time you have to finish the task. And the same is true for data on your phone, right? Like the amount of storage, your data will expand to fill the amount of available storage on your iPhone. So instead, we need to flip the script on that equation and think about it differently. We need to subscribe to ourselves. Meaning, just like Netflix is a monthly subscription, I'm not even thinking about that $20 a month coming out of my account to going to pay for Netflix. Why don't I do that for myself? I'm going to set up an automated monthly contribution into my savings account that happens at the beginning of the month. So you're paying yourself first. Your income comes in, you take your savings out, put it into a separate account that you will not draw from, and what's left over is the amount that you have to spend for your expenses. And that forces you sometimes to get more creative, to stay underneath that threshold of expenses. The analogy that I like to use is the end of a toothpaste. When you got the whole toothpaste, you're just using as much as you want. But when you get down to that last little bit, you are figuring out a creative way to get the last little bit out of that. And we do the same thing when we restrict the amount that we have left for expenses by paying ourselves first, by subscribing to ourselves with that automated monthly contribution into our savings account first. Okay, let's get into the numbers with a little bit more depth. First things first, here is the foundational recommendations for how we can go about finding our cash flow. What this is it's a simple iteration of the 50-30-20 principle. You may have heard of this principle within personal finance. It says that 50% of our income goes towards our needs, 30% goes towards our wants, and 20% goes towards our savings and debt repayment. That's a pretty good starting place, but it does need some adjustments for the modern world. And in fact, what you see on the screen here could even use some adjustments for different people at different points in their life. And that's why we offer the one-on-one coaching that we do over at On Tap Credit Union. So please take advantage of that. I feel like that is a great resource that not enough people take advantage of, because being able to dig in on a very personal level just takes people to the next stage of their financial journeys, whether it's finding out the specifics of this or even learning how to optimize their income. But talking about this, what this says is I'm going to try to get my living expenses. Those are the needs category of the 50-30-20 principle. I'm going to try to get those to between 50 to 60% of my take-home pay. Again, this is a very optimal general recommendation. So many people will plug in their numbers and it turns out their living expenses are at 76% or maybe 92%. And they are like, oh my goodness, I'm way high. Is that something they need to stop and fix immediately though? No, because we can really do three things with our money. We can make no changes, which you're probably going to get the same results, or you can make small incremental changes over time to work towards your goal, or you can make those big changes, which hopefully will result in bigger results. And we'll use the cash flow tool that you'll see in a moment to figure out if those big changes are really going to create the results that you want or not. The second category here is I'm going to try to get my savings to between 5 to 10% of my take-home pay. The savings are for my shorter term goals. That's for the long-term emergency reserve, because something's going to happen in my life, and that can help me to weather a storm. It can create freedom even when something happens in my life, like my car breaks down. Then I'm going to try to get my 10% of my income going towards my investments. Again, as an automated monthly contribution. That might be my 401k. It could be a Roth IRA. It could be a traditional brokerage account. It could even be an HSA. However, if I can get to 10% of that goal, those investments are for the long term. So I'm going to be setting myself up for my tomorrow self way down the road. And that means that for the last category, I can begin to feel good about the spending that I'm going to do today. So this term, the guilt-free spending number, that's the wants within the 50-30-20 principle. I used to call this my fun and BS account, but I love this term. It comes from Ramesh Sethi, a highly recommended financial influencer out there. He calls it the guilt-free spending number, which I love because how many of us feel guilty when we spend on ourselves? And yet, what's the point of money? Is it just to, go to work, pay the bills, and die? Like, we should be able to know exactly what is my number, that I get to enjoy some of the things that light me up in my life. So again, this is a recommendation for, it may be something that somebody who's only 25 years old is shooting for over the long term, because when I'm 25, hey, my guilt-free spending may be a little lower because I'm focused on putting some money towards my investments while I'm young. And so maybe I'm only at 10% or 5% on my guilt-free spending, but my goal is to begin to get my living expenses down so that my guilt-free spending goes up even while I have appropriate contributions towards my savings and investments. Okay, if we take the full equation now, it gets a little more complicated, but essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my income and I'm going to subscribe to myself. So my savings and investments come out first. Again, maybe that's a long-term emergency fund that I'm funding with $100 a month, and it's investments because I have access to a 401k that has let's say a great 5% match, and I want to make sure I'm matching that full 5% of my income. So that comes out at the beginning when I get paid, and then that leaves me what's left over, which is my expenses. My expenses are my living expenses plus my guilt-free spending number. Now, when we're getting into it with our specific numbers, most people find that living expenses are one of the hardest problems in personal finance to calculate. So on the next screen, when I flip the slide here, there's going to be a short video that plays that gives an introduction to the OnTap mobile app and why it can be so valuable for helping to quickly assess living expenses. Now, there are many different apps out there. Hopefully your own bank that you have already has a fantastic app that is similar in this regard. If it does not, hit us up, come open a free account at a not-for-profit community charter organization like us, and I think you'll really like what we got going on us, especially if you don't currently love where you bank. Welcome to the OnTap mobile app, your one-stop hub for all your financial and money management needs. I'll guide you through some of the app's key features to help you streamline your finances. First, let's explore the group creation feature. Here, I'm setting up a group called Home Accounts for demonstration, but remember, you can name it anything that suits your needs. You'll find this new group at the bottom. Simply press Move Group up and organize it as per your preferences. I personally like to arrange my accounts starting with my cash flow accounts, which are my checking accounts, followed by my savings. Another handy feature. So you heard me say there that I like to have my accounts set up in that regard. One other group that I like to use is the credit card group. I use credit cards as most of my spending cards. And so all of those being categorized in one section, you can link external cards into it. And then from there, that's where this next section will make sense because it can track your spending over some period of time that you define, followed by my savings. Another handy feature is linking your credit or spending cards to the app. This can include both internal and external cards, enhancing the app's versatility. Now, observe, you can categorize expenditures. It's not just broad categories like food and drinks, but you can delve deeper. For instance, selecting specific types like groceries and viewing exact transactions within each category over various time ranges. This feature is that is a very useful tool. Now, let us begin to dive into the actual cash flow spreadsheet. When you get your own copy of the cash flow spreadsheet, you will see it prompts you to make your own copy. Click that and it'll open up a Google Sheets version for you. Email me if you would prefer an Excel version. I can send that over. Many folks have Google Sheets, so I find it's pretty ubiquitous these days. What you'll find is the first page is simply an introductory page. It has this link to it that has a YouTube video that goes into the quick overview of how to use this spreadsheet. The second page is where you will enter your living expenses now that you have them using one of those apps to make it pretty quick to get your average numbers in that regard. The third page is your dashboard page. So you'll see that the various ratios plus a few other helpful numbers like your months of reserves start filling in once you have your cash flow section filled in. And there's also a net worth calculator over here. You will fill these numbers in yourself to calculate your net worth. My encouragement is don't get too obsessed with that one particular number. Now, this is an example that we see from a gentleman named Anthony. So Anthony's story is, and this is a made up scenario, but it is based off of many different coaching sessions that I've done with real people. So his story is he recently completed training as an administrative assistant. He got a role as a customer service associate. He's making $50K a year. He's got a reasonable car, used Honda Civic. He's got student loans, $25,000 of them. He's got credit card debt, $10,000 at 29% interest. And he wants to create a long-term emergency reserve savings of 3 months of living expenses. That can help him to get through in case something happens. His car breaks down, he gets laid off and loses his job. That gives a buffer where you have the freedom to make calm decisions about what to do next rather than scrambling to figure out what to do and going into more debt while getting yourself out of that situation. So very noble goal there to create that emergency reserve savings. Okay, so he's wondering what he should do to begin achieving his goals. Well, let's check it out. As you can see on the dashboard, he's at 102% on his living expenses. And I can see right away his housing expense ratio is pretty high, 38%. So that is very high. That's something that I would recommend he looks into as a big change to make. How can he bring that housing ratio down? However, that might not be something that he wants to do right now. So let's check out the rest of the scenario here. We can see that he went ahead and plugged in his gross monthly income. He may have gone to the last page here and used this resource for how to calculate your net pay. It's just a link to a net pay calculator, or maybe he looked at that through his um uh through his pay stub itself to figure out what his net pay was and entered that info. Okay, so again, at 102% on living expenses, high rent based on the percentage. It's 38%. General recommendation is to be at 28% or lower. That's really hard to do, especially in Colorado because housing is so expensive. However, what if he was to get a roommate? It looks like he's young, he's single, and a roommate is another job in some senses. Like you have to do tenant selection, get the right person in there. You got to make rules and decide, hey, are dishes ever going to be allowed in the sink? There's a lot to it. And yet, at the same time, like you're a landlord, it is another job to have a roommate, and that creates a source of income that could perhaps drastically reduce his living expenses. So I ask many people who are faced with high housing costs, like, hey, you don't have a roommate right now. Would you rather have a roommate and deal with all the things that comes along with it, or get to go on one extra awesome vacation or seeing family per year? Well, many people have an answer to that. Some people are like, yeah, I love my personal space. I can go on one less vacation, but have my own space every day. And other people are like, yeah, I can handle the roommate if it means I get to take one extra trip per year. Like, yeah, that's a sacrifice that I can make. However, in this case, I'm going to say, let's not even look at changing his housing ratio, his housing expense right now. And instead, $1,500 a month for somebody who's young in the Denver area, it is really hard to find anything lower than that. Like that is, I'm even with a roommate, maybe you can lower that. And I have seen lots of examples of it, but let's not touch that for right now. Instead, what I want to share is the fact that out of all of these living expenses, you may notice that the last category is in miscellaneous, which automatically adds 15% on top of your living expenses for things that you might have forgotten. Now, I think that category is extremely useful and valuable because many people, even with that tool, when they go through their living expenses, many people will still forget some things here and there. Maybe they buy a ski pass here in Colorado once per year, and since it didn't, it's like one of those things that's kind of a other categorization. It only happens once a year. Maybe it didn't show up in their monthly numbers. Now, in that case, I think that the 15% buffer makes a lot of sense. However, in Anthony's case, he's at 100, actually slightly above 100% of his income. So he's certainly the definition of living paycheck to paycheck. Plus, he's going into credit card debt from some of the spending that he has per month. So let's say that in Anthony's case, I would say this miscellaneous, that's probably for him a lot of the type of stuff that, maybe he doesn't pack his own lunch from his groceries. He goes out to get food externally somewhere one day at work. Or maybe he does end up going out with friends for some drinks a couple of nights a month or whatever. So like, I would say that some of this, when he's at that type of an income level, some of this could be tightened up just from getting really intentional with understanding where some of that extra miscellaneous expenses might go, and tightening up some of that guilt-free spending for right now so that he can perhaps work on paying off the rest of that credit card debt first so that he can go way bigger in the future with his friends or whatever it is that lights him up. So let's say that $300 of this, he could just get conscious and cut out of this particular number here. So I'm going to go ahead and manipulate this number, and I'm going to leave it at $146 instead of where it was at $446 for the miscellaneous. Now you'll notice that down at the bottom, he was already over. So instead of being $300 a month, this is now $211 in his guilt-free number. So should Anthony take that full 211 and just go like have fun with it? Probably not, right? So instead, what if we were to split those payments between paying off a credit card and putting some money towards a long-term emergency reserve? At $100 a month going towards the long-term emergency reserves, well, that would be $1,200 after a year. So that is going to allow him to, again, be free to be calm when something does happen, an unexpected expense, car breakdown, whatever the case is. And let's then go look at these credit card payments. So looks like he's paying $250 a month on credit card payments right now. How are we going to decide how to approach that credit card payment? Well, I'm going to just type in debt repayment calculator. Let's go to the first one that pops up. Notice that any debt repayment calculator, of course, there's going to be some kind of an advertiser disclosure here, although I think this one's a pretty good one overall. So I believe it was $10,000 that he had in credit card debt. It was at a 29% interest rate, pretty common for young folks who have not established a long history of credit, although it is a massive number. And so you're going to see that this is a absolutely astounding amount of interest being paid on this particular payoff, paying the minimum payment of only $250 a month. So check this out, 143 months to pay this thing off. It's $10,000 of principal, but he's going to pay $25,000 in interest just to pay this thing off. That is insane. This number will be greatly affected or changed if he was only paying 20% interest instead of 29. Let's just see, 6,000 instead of 25,000. But let's go back to the 29% interest. So in Anthony's case, what if he was to put an extra, let's say an extra $100, since I believe that's what we had in our cash flow spreadsheet. We got 111 left down here. If we make this number 350 instead of 250, it leaves me with very little guilt-free spending. However, the ability to pay this off more quickly may be more important to him. Let's see what $350 a month does to him. Now he is down to just 50 months to pay this credit card off and only $7,000 of interest. That is a massive difference in the amount that he has to pay in interest. So I would say that is really attractive to me. So that's $100 a month going towards a long-term emergency reserve and $100 going towards his credit card debt repayment. The beautiful thing about this is that after he pays that full amount off, that's $350 going back into his cash flow that he can then redirect elsewhere if he wants to. So that is a way for him to at least begin to get away from this 100% challenging living expense ratio. He's still at 96%. He's still going to have to work on things over time. Maybe he works on increasing his income. We do coaching on that. That has been very successful. It includes things like resume optimization, interview skills, networking, informational interviews, even side gigs. However, in Anthony's case, maybe he goes back to that idea of looking at getting a roommate. Maybe he looks for other areas to reduce costs within his living expenses because it can make a big difference in his overall life. Okay, let's look into another example here. So I'm going to click on this second example now. This is Evan and Eve, and these are two teachers. So you can see that this is a couple in this case rather than an individual. So they're going to have things look a little bit different. You can see here, Evan's a marketing specialist. He's making $75K. Eve is a teacher. She's making $50K. They're both salaried. They both have cars. They make monthly payments on the auto loan. They have a 3-year-old daughter, but they can sometimes utilize the grandparents for childcare. So that should be a huge relief in the monthly childcare payments. They would like to be able to build up a long-term emergency reserve savings of at least 3 months living expenses. They're paying off credit card debt also, $8,000 at 22% interest. They also have some student loans between them. Their cars only have 1 year of payments left. They're worth about $15,000. What could they do to build up the reserves and design their lives the way they want to? I'm going to go to the dashboard page first. I can see just briefly their net worth is negative. That makes sense because they have a lot of student loans. They got some auto loans. They have their credit card debt. They also have a high living expense ratio. It's 84%. However, their housing expense ratio looks pretty darn good. 30%, not bad. Like, we're not going to be saying, hey, you should go get a roommate. They're already in a good space there. Their savings and investments are quite low. They're going to want to try to work on that over time. Their guilt-free percentage, though, is also low. And at the end of the day, these are the types of things that I think we'll be able to make some small adjustments over time that get them to within the recommended ranges. Now, let's start to look at their actual living expenses. They have their income plugged in here. Partner 1 is Evan. Partner 2 is Eve. What do you notice about the overall living expenses as compared to the individual living expenses? And hopefully the answer is, dude, Evan's only paying 74%. Like, it's high for living expenses, but it's not bad. Whereas Eve is at 99%. Like everything she's making is going towards just her living expenses on a month-to-month basis. And as we dig into some of these numbers, what we notice is they're splitting the rent evenly, 50-50. They're also splitting utilities. Looks like insurance is a little bit different. They have different car payments, but for many things, they're splitting pretty darn evenly. And that is causing Eve to be paying like all of her money on living expenses. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that Evan is contributing to his 401k. He's contributing to some savings, some long-term emergency reserves, but Eve isn't doing either of those things. And when it comes to their guilt-free number, between the two of them, they have $1,000 a month to work with, which is pretty not bad. Like that's pretty awesome given their overall living situation. However, almost all of it is coming from Evan. So this is a situation where what I would recommend to them is we start to talk about what it would look like. And this is a long conversation because there's many feelings and emotions that come into it. But I think technically the solution would be to pay proportionally for things that they share, like rent, rather than to try to split things 50-50 and try to keep it even. Many times the lower earner is obsessed with contribution, with trying to make things, to trying to contribute as much as possible so it's as even as possible. But the thing is, if they were to rearrange these, then perhaps Eve could also be contributing to a 401k. And when they're young like they are, that makes a big difference by the time they retire. Then they could more evenly split everything if Evan was taking on a little bit more. There may also be some other pieces that they want to adjust and manipulate and figure out how to pay off their extra credit card debt. And again, we could go into this and let's just see right now, $8,000 a month at 22% interest. 22% is not bad. I believe they're paying $200 between the two of them. So they're going to pay $6,000, $6,500 over 73 months to pay this credit card off. What if they were to increase their payments even just by $50 a month? We go from $6,500 of interest to only $4,100 of interest. So that's a significant savings. They're down to 49 months. What if they were to come up with an extra $100 a month to figure out how to pay that off? They're down to 30 months and only $2,400 of interest. However, they may instead want to redistribute some of that into their long-term emergency reserves or into their 401ks. So let's say that Eve was able to contribute to a 401k. Also, I'm going to go to investor.gov, the compound interest calculator, and just see what does this do for their long-term retirement funds. Let me see if they have anything in their investments so far. It looks like they got $5,000 in investments. So let's start with an initial investment of $5,000. And we'll go back to see that Evan is contributing $155 a month towards his 401k, $155. They are, I can't remember, I think they're 30 years old. So let's run this for 35 years until they're 65. And we can assume pretty conservatively an estimated interest rate of 7% per year. That includes inflation over that amount of time. Let's see what they end up with. Okay, in 35 years, they have $310,000. That probably doesn't seem like enough to retire on. But check this out. They only contributed $70,000 over that time, whereas they ended up with $310,000 in that investment account. The power of compounding right there. However, let's see what happens if Eve was able to add another $100 into this mix. So now we're going to make it $255 a month, and instead of $310, we're at $476. Now, we can expect that over time, they're going to increase their contributions, but what if we were to figure out how the two of them could over time increase that to $500 a month instead of $255? Let's see where they end up. $882,000 now. And as you can see, you could start playing with these numbers a little bit more. What if they were to wait just a little bit longer? Instead of retiring at 65, what if they retired at 67, or let's even say 60, or 68, 70. Okay, now we're at 1.1 million. What if they were to go all the way until they were 70? 1.2 million, right? So this is starting to make a big difference. What if they wanted to retire early? Well, then we would have to say, let's say they only want to retire at 59 and a half. And let's just calculate this. 604,000, probably not enough to retire, but what if they were to increase that monthly contribution up to $1,000 a month? We're at 1.1 again. So like maybe that gives them a pathway, but you can see how you can begin to, let's say, spend 30 minutes playing with this contribution calculator and come back and see like that is the importance of investing often and early. So this can be a really powerful tool for people. And again, it's the big playing field that we want to keep in mind when we're dealing with all of this. So I'm going to close out of this example scenario at this point and say a few more things to close this deeper dive out. Of course, all of this is ultimately personalized. However, this would be a version of a recommended system that creates bumper lanes. You can see that your paycheck, your 401k is coming directly out of your paycheck, so you're already subscribing to yourself, but your paycheck gets direct deposited into your main cash flow account. That's your checking account. What I recommend to people is that they have a second checking account that is called the guilt-free account. That is where once you know how much you have every single month for your guilt-free number, in the example of Evan and Eve in that last section, they had $1,000 a month. Maybe they wanted to reduce the amount of guilt-free spending that they had right now to up their investment contributions over time. Who knows? But let's say they keep it at $1,000 a month. That would mean that at the beginning of every month, they would send $1,000 into that guilt-free spending account. And that allows you to simply log into that app on your phone to be able to see where you're at that point in the month. That is the immediate feedback that allows you to figure out, okay, cool, everything's separated. I don't have to do the tracking on this anymore. I know that this one card is my guilt-free card that I use for all of those types of purchases. However, I can go and log in and say, oh shoot, I'm only 5 days into the month and I've already blown through half of my guilt-free spending. Goodness, I need to modulate that a little bit better. And that is what allows us to gain that intuitive feel. You can also see that from the cash flow account that we have an automated withdrawal into savings and investments. And then as much of our other living expenses as possible, we want to automate. We want to automate our rent. We want to automate our utilities payment, our internet, all of those things. And then, of course, there are certain things like gas money, groceries that can't be automated, but that many people will use an intermediary layer of credit cards. Lots more to say on that front. So let's chat further, perhaps in a one-on-one session when you want to create your own system for this, about the pros and cons of each tool and how you want to design it for yourself. One more thing I'll say is you may have also mentioned that there was a planning tool over here. I like to use some type of a calendar tool. I do it all on my mobile phone to figure out when those credit card payments are due and line that up each month. It makes things very simple to quickly see where we're at. Everything is automated, so I don't have to worry about it. But the reason that I like to go ahead and schedule that is because you do, when things are automated, you do want to be able to go do a quick audit and look for the next 2 months ahead and say, all right, is there anything coming up that may cause me to get off track with my cash flow planning here? So a tool like that can be very useful. Okay, we're getting towards the end here. And so, of course, I need to tell you a little bit more about us over here at On Top Credit Union. We are a not-for-profit community chartered credit union. And so that is why we're able to do as much foundational, no-cost financial education and coaching in our community as possible. So without making this into a sales pitch, I will simply say, if you don't love your bank right now, come and hit us up. Check out some of the services that we have to offer. I bet that if you open a free account over here, you will like what we have going on. And of course, you don't need to be a member to book a introductory coaching session with us. Membership is free, of course, but you can go ahead and book that first 15-minute introductory call without even needing to go through the 5-minute application process that is free to become a member. Okay. I also wanted to highlight, we do have a 6-week coaching program. It doesn't have to be consecutive weeks. You'll hop on the phone with us for 6 weeks in a row. We'll cover a number of different topics. One thing that I will highlight here is that one of the topics that many people end up focusing on is optimizing income. I mentioned before that that can include a number of things like interview skills, even exploring side gigs. That is an incredibly important part of the equation because we can only cut our expenses so much, whereas our income is theoretically unlimited. And the more that we make ourselves valuable to the world, the more we'll be able to be paid for it. And so that is a very useful resource out there for people. Okay, closing this out with a couple more slides. And this one, I got to return to the psychology of money because I like to talk about making our money joyful. And this quote from Joe Hudson resonates there. He says, "Joy is the matriarch of the family of emotions, and she will not come into a house where her children are not welcomed." A joyful life is not one in which we deny or even simply accept other emotions. We have to welcome them all in and become a student of what is going on with each of them in order to experience the joy. In our money lives, not everything will be flowers and roses. Instead, there will be hard moments. There will be hard conversations. I think somebody out there, maybe it was Tim Ferriss, talked about that one of the ways that you can tell the quality of somebody's life is the number of hard conversations they're willing to engage in. And so it's not all joy all the time. We have to really become students of how we're approaching these conversations. And one of the pieces here is about this idea that there are more types of wealth or health than just the financial side of things. Morgan Housel talks sometimes about how very successful people, they could also kind of just be seen as like walking anxiety disorders harnessed for productivity. Like the single word that he would use to describe a lot of successful people might not be driven or passionate, but instead tortured. Like they wake up every day trying to get ahead, having to solve this problem. There was a interview at some point, I think, from Elon Musk, where he said, you might want to be me. You might want to be the richest person in the world, but you don't. It's a tornado up there. It's a mess inside my head. And so the point there is just that we can look at people who are considered financially successful sometimes, but we may not want that entire life because for us, we may want to focus on the other types of wealth or health in our life. Sahel Bloom wrote a book called The 5 Types of Wealth, where he describes these. Essentially, we can have financial wealth or health, and that's a foundational piece. Like if we're worried about where we're going to sleep at night, then it's really hard to focus on the other components that are important in our lives. So getting our money management straight and in order can enable us to chase after the other types of health that are important. But we can't go 100% on all 5 at the same time. So there may be different seasons of our life. The other types of health are physical health. Like if I don't have my physical health, then A, I may be spending a lot more money on medical bills, but B, like it might be really hard to achieve my mental health or even financial health also if I'm not able to go to work. So that's something that we need to prioritize, and it might be more prioritized at different times in our lives. Our mental health is similar, and mental health could also be seen as spiritual health, believing in something bigger than ourselves. The other piece here is that we're human beings. So our social and relational health is incredibly important as well. And we need to pour into those relationships to have gratifying lives ourselves. And finally, our time health. Do we get to spend our time as we see fit, doing the things we love to do with the people we love to do them with? Do we have that flexibility? And so keeping in mind that ultimately the goal is to balance all of these, I think is really important. And we may want to go hard, as you're doing now, learning about our financial health and our systems that will allow us to get there. But the goal ultimately is to be able to understand them intuitively, put them on autopilot so that we can focus on the other things in our lives that matter greatly. One more thing that I will mention, I mentioned Morgan Housel previously, one of my favorite influencers out there. He talks about compounding optimism. There's nothing new in this world. It's just all compounded from the ideas of others so that we take bits and pieces and form them into something that works for our lives. And I've certainly done that with my own money management and my financial styles. These are some of the resources that I recommend and draw from. Many of them are financial, but not all of them. And so I wanted to give this list there for people to go and check out. Feel free to ask me more about these when you book one of your one-on-one sessions, and we can dig into some of the resources that you might enjoy checking out first. This brings us to the end. If you're checking this out on YouTube and you have your phone available, you may want to scan one of these QR codes. The first one over here on the right side is our free PDF guide. This is the quick start path to begin to develop a better relationship with your money. So this is 5 quick techniques and tactics called Money Hacks Guide. If you don't have your phone available, just go ahead and type on tap CU Money Hacks into your search bar, and you should be able to find that. You can also book a 15-minute intro call with me using the QR code over here on the left. And in the middle here, if you don't mind, tell me what you think. This is to a survey to see what you thought. Was this useful for you? So I love to collect feedback and continue to improve this as we go. And finally, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Marshall M. Moore, or shoot me an email with any other questions to schedule a session that's longer than 15 minutes or whatever it is that's on your mind. Recommending more resources, telling me something that resonated with you during this session. Thank you all so much. Make it a great day.